weekend. Each man must do his bit.
Welcome to another edition of The Public Interest. My name is David Granger, and we continue our examination of Guyana's public policy, particularly with the focus today or this month on international relations, and again, the matter of the enslavement of people in the Western Hemisphere. As you know, I felt that the month of August should be regarded as Black History Month, at least for Guyanese. We don't share the view that the American Black History Month is quite relevant, as maybe it's relevant for the Americans. But this is certainly Black History Month for Guyanese. And today we will look at the question of how the enslaved Africans emancipated themselves. Emancipation was not a gift from a beneficent queen. It is not an endowment. It is an entitlement, but it is an entitlement for which the African people in the Western Hemisphere had to struggle. Many of us at home and abroad 10 years ago could not have imagined the volume and the vitality of the response of people in 4 continents to the murder of George Floyd in May 2020. This was a phenomenon. As you know, about 60 countries were involved in the protest against the circumstances surrounding the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota. 2,000 cities had protests. 26 million people were on the streets of their respective capitals protesting against the circumstances under which George Floyd was murdered. This was something inconceivable maybe a decade or 2 ago, that one Black man in Minneapolis could have brought 26 million people on the streets. And of course, not only persons of African descent, also people of indigenous origins in Colombia and elsewhere, and even Australia, were protesting against the whole concept of enslavement and discrimination and so on. Another important event occurred last week. That is, we got news that a woman called Francia Marquez was sworn in as the Vice President of Colombia, a Black woman who proudly wears kente and other African adornments, was sworn in for the first time on the South American continent as the Vice President of Colombia. This would have been unheard of 10 years ago. But things are changing, and it just shows that the fruit of emancipation are now being ripened, and people around the world are becoming conscious of what the Africans went through and what they deserve. So these 2 events, the response to the murder of George Floyd in May 2020 and the response to the election of Francia Marquez in Colombia and her being sworn in as vice president last week, these are more than symbolic. They represent an attitudinal shift for what we have endured in this continent and this hemisphere for over 200 years. Let us look first of all at the question of the dispersal of captive Africans throughout the Western Hemisphere. Millions of captives were transported. I wouldn't get into the arithmetic now. People say it's about 12 million. Other people say it might be 20 million. The arithmetic is still being done. Nobody knows for sure because no proper records were kept. And of course, as you know, many Africans, fearful of what would happen to them in the Middle Passage or when they arrived at some destination which to them was unknown, simply jumped in the sea. Some mutinied and were thrown in the sea. And so the figures right now are surrounded with a lot of uncertainty and surmise and speculation. But certainly we know that in North, South, Central America and the Caribbean, during the so-called transatlantic trade in captive Africans, millions of people, certainly in excess of 12 million people, landed. We don't know how many went to the bottom of the Atlantic in that middle passage. And let me give you an idea of the scale of the dispersal. So you can see that hardly any country was left untouched by that African presence in during the transatlantic trade. Captives went to Argentina, as far as south in South America as you can get, to Bolivia. British American colonies, don't forget, until 1776, all these colonies, Carolina, Virginia, were actually British colonies. And then the British West Indies, whether Antigua, Bahamas, Barbados, Bermuda, Dominica, Grenada, Honduras, Jamaica, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, Tobago, Trinidad, and the Virgin Islands. Then you had the Danish Antilles. Yes, Denmark had colonies. St. Croix, St. John, St. Thomas. I think they still preserve their colonial names, but now they're the property of the United States of America. Then you had the Dutch Antilles, Aruba, Bonaire, Curacao, Saba, St. Eustatius, St. Martin. And then the French Antilles and Guyana, Guadeloupe, Martinique, and of course, the colony of Guyana. And there was also Chile. Slaves went to Chile, Colombia, Cuba, Ecuador, Louisiana. At first, Louisiana was a French territory. Later on, it was sold to the United States. But under the French, Louisiana received captive Africans. Mexico, Panama, Paraguay, Puerto Rico, Saint Domingue, which later, after 1804, became Haiti, the independent Republic of Haiti. Santo Domingo, which is now known more or less as Dominican Republic. Suriname, Uruguay, Venezuela, all of these countries in North, Central, South America, and the Caribbean received captives during that horrible transatlantic trade in captive Africans. So you can see the scale, the spread was quite wide. Now, enslaved Africans were the sinews, the muscle of the plantation economies of the Western Hemisphere, both North America and South America, and the Caribbean, of course. As we know, our foreparents came here to work on the plantations. The maritime states which transported the captives in the largest numbers were Portugal, which is estimated to have transported about 3.8 million captives. Britain, 3.1 million. France, 1.3 million. The Netherlands, 596,000. Spain, 566,000. United States, 377,000. And Denmark, 100,000. Now, please remember that some of these countries sold captives to other countries. So even if they might appear to have been importing a small number directly, they might have bought from others. A country like Barbados, for example, was an important transshipment point, and some captives were resold to plantations elsewhere. So the numbers could be quite confusing. I don't want to get involved in the numbers game at this stage. But it is quite clear that this huge volume of trafficking during the era of enslavement moved what can be called, it was the greatest movement, the greatest forced migration of people in world history. The rough estimates, rough estimates, don't hold me to these figures, please. Brazil alone took about 41.8% of all of the captives leaving Angola, leaving Africa. Most of the Brazilian captives were extracted from Angola. The Spanish American countries, and I told you some of them, Mexico, Colombia, Panama, Peru, Argentina. The Spanish American took about 21.8% of all of the captives. British America, and again I remind you that the North American colonies at that time before 1776 were still British, and they and the Caribbean had about 90% of all the captives removed from Africa. French Caribbean, places like Guadeloupe, Martinique, and later French Guyana had about 11.6% of all captives, and the Dutch Caribbean had about 3.0%. Don't forget the Dutch were very proficient shippers, and they shipped captives to other countries in great volume. So the fact that they were delivered in small numbers in their own territories meant that they had small territories, and they weren't particularly interested in plant. They weren't interested in trade. They were interested in commodities, and human commodities in this place, in the form of captives. So these countries received the greatest number of captives, moving them from Africa to the Americas. And even in countries where there were no plantations, it became the practice, particularly in Hispanic and Portuguese, or some people call them Lusitanian countries. Many captives were employed as artisans or domestic servants in the Portuguese and Spanish households and towns. So all of them didn't work in the field, but they were slaves, and there was no mistake about that. Now, the topic this morning is about how Africans emancipated themselves, how enslaved Africans emancipated themselves. And there were riots, there were revolts, many ran away, and there was marronage. They went into the bush. Of course, in the bigger countries like Brazil, Jamaica, where there was bush, some countries had no bush, like Barbados and so on, a very small place. And even in Guyana, there was marronage, and many people didn't know Guyana had maroons. Suriname still has maroons. And in the countries with a huge hinterland, many of the enslaved Africans, ran away and formed their own communities rather than stay on the plantations and be killed. And many of them lived, to tell the story another day. So if you look at the history of the Western Hemisphere, from the time that the transatlantic trade started, just about 30 years after Columbus arrived here in 1492, within 30 years, the revolt started. For example, in Santo Domingo, which of course is now Dominican Republic island, which is shared with Haiti, revolt started as early as 1521. Then in 1532, 1796, 1802, 1812 in Brazil, 1605, 1694, Colombia, throughout the 16th century, the Danish Antilles in 1733, 1848, the Dutch Antilles in Curacao, 1795, the French Antilles, Martinique, Guadeloupe in 1678 and 1802, Saint-Domingue, which later became Haiti. Of course, the big one is 1791, the Great Revolution, the Great Haitian Revolution. In Berbice, 1763, and of course, in 1823. In Cuba, 1795, 1798, 1802, 1805, 1812, 1825, 1827, 1829, 1833, 1834, 1835, 1838, 1839, 1844. You can see the frequency, the relentless revolt against enslavement. People were not docile. People didn't accept, subjugation, and they revolted. In Dominica, 1795, St. Lucia, 1795, Grenada, 1795, Venezuela, 1795. And let me tell you something. All of these revolutions you hear breaking out in 1795 were inspired by the Haitian Revolution, which broke out in 1791. So many of the islands, in the Caribbean were inspired by the example of the Haitian Revolution, Toussaint Louverture, and later on Jean-Jacques Dessalines, a very cruel man. In Barbados, 1816, in Demerara, we had Maroons on the West Demerara, and there was a huge revolt. Many people don't celebrate that revolt. They think only about the 1763 and 1823, but there was a big revolt on the West Demerara in 1795. And the Dutch had to send punitive patrols to hunt them. But they got a good licking but from the Maroons, nevertheless. British Virgin Islands in 1790, 1823, 1830. Puerto Rico, 1821. Mexico, 1570. Virginia, in what is now the USA, in 1663, New York in 1712, Louisiana, which at that time was French territory. Later on, they sold it to United States. In 1731 and 1811, South Carolina, 1739, North Carolina in 1802, Virginia again in 1831. So you can see that revolts, riots, and revolution were frequent occurrences during that 400 period of enslavement in the Western Hemisphere. But there are others which were perhaps small or perhaps they weren't recorded. And they're really too numerous to mention. My friends, you can see that the enslaved Africans struggled relentlessly to emancipate themselves. They didn't wait for handouts. They didn't wait for any endowment from a benevolent queen. They struggled to free themselves. They were not comfortable. They never accepted the enslavement. Now, we need to look also at not only the day-to-day resistance in the form of revolt, but there was also, as I said, marronage, where territory permitted them to go into the bush. And in Jamaica particularly, in Jamaica, you had Maroons who fought the British to a standstill and signed agreements. And up to now, you still have Maroons who have rights as other semi-autonomous sub-states within Jamaica, and similarly in Suriname, where the Maroons are left alone because they signed agreements with the rulers, in the case of Jamaica, the British, and in the case of Suriname, the Dutch, to be left alone, to allow to manage their own communities. But obviously, the slave owners hunted down the runaways. And slave hunting was prevalent, in all of the countries, including Guyana, but particularly in the island countries, certainly in Brazil, in Cuba, Jamaica, Haiti, and in the British American colonies. You had these huge hunting parties which would go out, and hunt slaves and very frequently kill them. And those who were captured were treated very brutally. They were tortured. There were specific laws, fugitive slave laws, which allowed owners to capture and return escapees to the plantations. So we had patrol, which helped to maintain what they would like to call economic order, because the enslaved Africans were property, were chattel. And the similarity between the word chattel and cattle is not a mistake. They were just two-legged animals, and they were just hunted down and killed, or they were brought back and punished very severely, as the French say, pour encourager les autres, to persuade the others not to repeat. When they saw the beheading and the cruel torture, many of the Africans who did not revolt would be hesitant to revolt. So the suppression of the revolt was very cruel. And this frequency of revolts reinforced the feeling, reinforced the belief that slavery was unsustainable, that you had to set up special regiments to go and hunt these slaves. Even in the Caribbean, the British West India Regiment was established in the 1790s, particularly to control, enslaved Africans. And in Guyana, you must always look at the establishment of the police force, the British Guyana police force, in 1839, less than 1 year after emancipation. So you can see the purpose of establishing the British Guyana police force. Less than a year after emancipation, in 1838, the police force is established in 1839. Nobody could miss that. It's not a coincidence. It was deliberate. So you can see that the question of slave resistance and revolt was taken very seriously. Yes, of course, there was a relentless movement towards abolition. It was not only based on the revolt and resistance by the enslaved Africans themselves. Those were the most important factors, no doubt. But in addition to that, by the middle decades of the 1800s, between sort of 1840 and 1860, many of the European countries, which have been most active in the transatlantic trade in captive Africans, realized the futility of the slave trade. Britain, Denmark, France, USA, and a few independent Spanish-American countries. By that time, of course, many countries like Venezuela and Colombia had tried to throw off the Spanish yoke. And many of them had started to grant emancipation to the Africans. And in that period, maybe a 30 or 40-year period, slavery was outlawed. But in Cuba, slavery persisted until 1886. And in Brazil, slavery persisted until 1888, a full 50 years after African Guyanese got freedom. Only then did Africans in Brazil get their freedom, their emancipation. So you can see it wasn't, a cut and dried situation. And in addition, as you know, some Christian denominations denounced enslavement of Africans. And most notably, and you must understand this, it wasn't the Anglican Church or the Catholic Church, it was the Puritans and the Quakers who railed against the transatlantic trade. In Britain and America, early evangelical movements published pamphlets, approached their national assemblies and the parliament, pointing out, and public opinion, of course, pointing out that slavery, the enslavement of one person by another, total control of a human being, was contrary to Christian doctrine. And contrary to the notion that those of you who believe that all men and women, all persons are created with equal rights by God. And in fact, in America, they went further. They established something called the American Colonization Society. And they proposed the idea of liberating slaves and sending them back to Africa. Of course, nobody knew where the Africans came from exactly. They knew a general area between Senegal and Angola, but it was impossible to reunite families or return people to their respective areas from which they were extracted. So it was problematic. So these new states, were created, particularly in Liberia and Sierra Leone, where Africans who were emancipated in British territories and American territories were sent back to Africa, but to places which were not their places of origin. And of course, this created new problems right up to the present time, because there were serious linguistic and ethnic differences among the Africans who came. And this is one of the reasons why some slave revolts actually did not succeed, because people from one ethnic group did not easily collaborate or cooperate with persons from other groups. And eventually, in any event, these emancipated slaves were sent back to Liberia and to some extent to Sierra Leone, and there might have been other settlements which I'm aware of. So we can now look at the impact of the slave revolts, impact of these efforts by enslaved Africans to emancipate themselves. The triangular trade was one in which Europeans, on the one hand, exported capital and manufactured merchandise. That's the first leg to Africa. Then they extracted African labor and took them to Americas and the Caribbean, that was the second leg. And then they took where they got land, and then they took primary commodities like cotton and sugar, rum and molasses, and took it back to Europe. So it's a triangular trade. Europe, Africa, the Americas, back to Europe. And this trade, the transatlantic trade and the triangular trade, molded the Caribbean and the Western Hemisphere. You cannot examine the demography, the economy, or the geography of the Western Hemisphere without considering the African presence. That is something we need to learn and understand. That there were changes. For example, when we speak of the Dutch Antilles, St. Croix, St. Thomas, and St. John, those were originally Dutch, but eventually became American. And of course, there have been changes in boundaries, but essentially, the question of the enslavement of Africans did not follow the rules of ownership, and all of those countries, Denmark, France, Portugal, Spain, United States, Britain, all of them participated in this evil trade, the transatlantic trade in Africa. And look at the United States itself. African slavery was the central issue in the United States Civil War between 1861 and 1865. 620,000 men died in that Civil War, where you had North versus South, people trying to preserve and others trying to destroy slavery. So you can see how important the biggest war, the greatest loss of American lives, took place between 1861 and 1865 over the question of slavery. You can't ignore slavery. You can't ignore the African presence. And of course, there was an unfortunate legacy, attitude, culture, intellectual burden. Slavery was racial. Slavery was racial. It was white people enslaving black people, simply. And the transition from enslavement to emancipation has been a very difficult path for persons of African descent. That is why I started this discussion today by pointing out that what happened in the case of George Floyd in May 2020 and the response by 26 million people around the world is so significant. People just got fed up of being discriminated against and being shot down in the streets. And of course, the election of Lucia Marquez in Colombia is a question of pride for the descendants of the victims of the transatlantic trade. The slave system, more or less, persisted for 400 years in the Western Hemisphere. But the wounds are deep. There are still structural inequalities which affect persons of African descent. There is still the persistence of racism. There is still racial domination. And these prejudices, this domination, these attitudes, these institutionalized, structures which work against Africans and against equality, because the indigenous people are also affected by these institutions. These have been manifested up to today in fields of social development, in the fields of human rights, of education, employment, health, social protection, and human safety. So emancipation is very much a work in progress. But in leaving this program, I want you to remember that slaves fought and died for their freedom. Emancipation was never an endowment, but emancipation has not been completed. And all people of all ethnicities living in the Western Hemisphere must do what the Colombian people do, be unafraid to elect a black woman, single mother, black woman as vice president. We must not be afraid to accept that all men really must be given, and women must be given equal opportunities. Their contributed to molding the Western Hemisphere, this Atlantic economy, and they must be able to benefit from the fruit and the product and the prosperity of the Western Hemisphere. Thank you, and may God bless you.
Let us cooperate.